All right, I think we're ready to get started. So call the meeting to order for the briefing meeting. Commissioners, the primary update at our meeting today is the opioid settlement funding plan. Are there any other items are there any other items people would like to discuss at the briefing meeting today? And are there any questions about any items on the agenda for the regular meeting? All right, then we will consider the agenda for the briefing meeting to be what we have published here. So let's go ahead and jump into it, and we'll get an update on the opioid settlement funding plan. So, Victoria, thanks for being with us.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Okay, so today I'm just going to give an update on our process for planning, as well as to share with you all a recommended financial plan. So we are currently wrapping up our immediate term phase of planning by sharing the recommendations for our first round of funding based on proximate community feedback. At the same time, we are entering into our short-term phase of planning by starting our strategic planning process. An outline of this process has been included in your handouts. Please let me know if there are any questions or feedback about what we have included. This does mirror what the MOA outlines as elements as part of strategic planning. And so with this, we are shifting our focus to the in-depth engagement needs identified by our fiscal year 23 project team to help shape recommendations for funding allocation after this fiscal year. This month, we formally began a steering committee with approximately 45 community stakeholders to guide the strategic planning process. So by leveraging the wisdom from this larger group, we will build a foundation for an intentional community outreach strategy, which we aim to foster throughout the next 17 years. We anticipate this committee to meet regularly between now and December to produce a plan designed to guide funding recommendations for the use of settlement funds in fiscal years 2024 through 2026. So looking at kind of expanding the timeline, letting people know what to expect versus every year not sure where that focus will be. So this committee will create each of the project outputs listed in the handout to inform the criteria that will serve as the basis for those future financial recommendations. So this group is really helping create that vision for us. What are those root cause analysis? Are we really getting to the depths of it, really scanning our community for the needs? And then with this kind of foundation, this vision, we can make future funding recommendations. So this group is not going to be recommending what gets funded, but what are those elements that we're looking for? What are those priorities? And so in our immediate term planning, as we heard proximate community feedback, we gathered together a project team to kind of dig in and prioritize the strategies to fund for this fiscal year. And they also helped guide how we engaged community members for a steering committee to work through the strategic planning process. And as a reminder, these are the 12 strategies outlined in the MOA that opioid dollars could be spent on to implement or expand programs in our community. Currently, Buncombe County is supporting all of these strategies. Many are funded through grants. Parts are funded directly by the county, and several are being supported in our community through various providers. Our project team used this list to identify what we would want to prioritize for this year. And so throughout discussions regarding how to use opioid dollars, we received consistent feedback from providers and community members with proximate experience, the importance of supporting grassroots organizations that are already doing the work in high need and historically marginalized communities. At the same time, the project team highlighted the urgency of action. We must use these dollars to save lives in our community today. And yet we also need to operate intentionally, really identifying those programs and strategies to support the efforts using data and understanding truly who is being served and who is not being served in our community, by whom, to what extent, and with what impact. So we were asked to understand the need for action within the context of existing gaps in access and opportunity for care. So with this in mind, we came to a compromise of identifying programs that are providing crucial life-saving services within the county and are currently facing time-sensitive funding needs due to grants ending this fiscal year, while also committing to a more in-depth strategic planning process designed to identify the types of gaps and opportunities for important consideration for funding. And so with this, we have identified that our Justice Services Reentry Program that is connecting clients to recovery services and treatment options after being released from jail or prison lose their current funding by February 28th, 2023. We also have the post-overdose response team that uses peer support specialists to connect clients after an overdose or at high risk of an overdose to recovery services and medication treatment, and they will run out of current funding by January 2023. Additionally, if public health were to not receive their Safer Together grant extension and budget modification for October 1st of this year, we may need to support the Port peer support and the Port therapist, as well as access to medications for addiction treatment for those that are uninsured or cannot afford treatment. In order to operationalize the need for both urgent action and thoughtful planning, we are recommending funds for a collaborative planning process. So in addition to these three funds, we're looking at being able to ensure that voices which have not traditionally been at the table are included. And this may look at tapping into people who are embedded into the community, they have the trust of the community to help lift those voices for those that they advocate. And in line with these conversations, our process has identified the need to explore opportunities to compensate community members for time and expertise contributed to the planning process, and to ensure that spaces for doing so are accessible, such as offering food, different times to meet, transportation, childcare, to allow people to share their thoughts and experiences and what they think is needed in our community. Further, we have learned that both recovery housing and early intervention for young people vulnerable to substance misuse are commonly shared priorities, but we need to further examine what is needed to effectively operationalize that financial support. So as a result, we have included the option to fund efforts designed to better understand the status of and needs surrounding each of these approaches in Buncombe County today. And so based on the requirements of the MOA, commissioners would be asked to approve the following strategies and dollar amounts through the end of fiscal year 2023. This is allowing us to have that stopgap for programs that are meeting the needs of our community while we're also getting into that deeper engagement, getting feedback for planning for fiscal year 24. We're hoping to be in line with the regular budgeting cycle, and so this is just to help extend some of our current programs through the end of this fiscal year. And this just kind of gives you a little bit of a visual. We're looking at spending a little over $500,000. This, if anything, would maybe adjust lower. My hope is that is the maximum that would be asked, potentially lower. And so then all of those dollars that we're receiving this fiscal year will be available for future planning, whether for fiscal year 2024, or it may be something that we're extending it through the years where funding reduces. So the next steps, my plan is for October 4th is to come to you all with a final recommended financial plan for approval. We will also be having some updates from our MAP program so that you all can hear the work that our Port team has been doing in conjunction with MAHEC and with the detention center, and even our syringe service program and the peer supports, and how all of those work together, as well as our reentry that helps connect people to those services. And between October and January, February, we're doing our strategic planning, deeper community outreach, So then I hope in January, February to provide updates about the planning process, what was the vision that our community came up with, the root cause analysis, et cetera. And with that, we will be integrating into the county's budget cycle for planning, having recommendations for the fiscal year 24 and through 2026. Any questions, feedback that you all may have?
Thank you all so much, and to staff and community partners, just a lot of hard work has gone into getting us to this point, and it's exciting to be at this stage. I had a couple questions, just want to make sure I'm tracking closely as we move forward. In terms of the slide that details the programs that this 518,000 would be allocated for, the community paramedicine, therapists, and medication for addiction treatment, would that actually be for additional MAT slots? That's what it says. Could you just elaborate on that a little
It
bit more?
would be to fulfill if the Safer Together grant does not get approved.
Right, okay.
So there's been a lot of back and forth, so there's a very good chance that the Safer Together will be able to have that covered. And it could look at extending that. What's that need? I know what I'm understanding is that we are looking at upping with MAHEC some of those slots, but that should be coming through the Safer Together grant. So I may on October 4th, maybe coming back and not needing immediate funding for that because the Safer Together grant is covering it.
Gotcha, and so we'll find that out soon.
Yes,
Okay.
every day there's almost an update.
Yeah, I'm sure. I know part of the whole dance here is these different funding sources and the timing. I guess part of what I'm drilling in on that is that it does feel like continuing to expand access to MAT, medication-assisted treatment, is a really high priority as we think about steps and interventions to actually reduce overdose deaths.
Yeah.
And so I would be really interested if we could just kind of go a little bit further down the rabbit hole into the data there and figure out, even if the Safer Together grant comes through to fund the existing level of MAT slots, what would it look like to actually expand MAT slots further? And is there the capacity to do that? Or what is the timeline around which that capacity could happen? And just as a bit to kind of continue the conversation with fellow commissioners, we've have invited for our next meeting, Dr. Suchin Shukla from MAHEC, Claire Hubbard from Community Paramedic, and Sarah Gayton from the MAT program at the detention center to share updates about what we're seeing from those programs, and also kind of a fresh look at overall data around overdose and overdose deaths. I think as everyone knows, and as is the case with many of the issues we're working on, the pandemic has been a really tough period. And we have seen, some concerning increases in overdoses and overdose deaths everywhere. But we're also seeing that when folks get access to MAT, it is saving lives. So as we think about kind of how we're investing this first stage of the settlement money, it feels like if there are opportunities for more members of our community to have access to MAT treatment, that's something I'd be really interested in as a starting point in that conversation.
And I think that's a good point of making sure people who are ready to get that treatment have access. And I think also understanding there's a lot, a lot more that goes along with that, right? Getting medication is one thing, but organizing yourself, be able to get to that appointment, all of those other needs. And so that's where even that recovery support services really helps. I know even heard recently that there were 100 reported community overdose reversals with naloxone. So we know that's being underreported. So while MAT is also important, it's also having naloxone available so that people have another day. Maybe today I wasn't feeling it, but now I've reached another low that I might be ready to access that treatment. And so it really is kind of all of these programs working together that gives people these opportunities to access that treatment. If not today, tomorrow. And what I even hear is a lot of the peer supports, they may have been offered services, they didn't accept it in the moment, but maybe a couple weeks later, they're calling that peer support to say, hey, what about today? And you're right, we want to make sure when they're ready that there is a slot and something available for them.
That's very helpful, thank you. I wanted to also just revisit, I think when you all had last presented to us, talked about community level RFP opening up through which additional funds would be administered. Is that something that you're thinking will happen in, or what's the timeline around when that might open up?
Probably in that January, February. So
Okay.
hopefully by the end of this year, we'll have a good vision, right? What are those elements that we want to see that can help guide what those RFPs may look like? And that we have a deeper understanding of what's needed, who's funded, who's not funded. And also, I think even figuring out, is it a request for proposals? If we're really wanting to look at grassroots organizations that are doing the work, what's going to be something that's accessible for them, recognizing some of the limitations. So I feel like, we're still diving in a little deeper on how can we make that accessible.
Thank you, that's super helpful. And again, I think just kind of bouncing, I appreciate this opportunity at the commission level to be having this conversation. And I think one of the questions that I'll look forward to engaging with folks as we head into our budget cycle is thinking about how what's happening through the settlement dollars connects into the broader body of work that the county has for many years been doing around opioid response. Just to be really clear, I think my great hope is that this funding can be really supplemental and help strengthen and expand our efforts, not just substitute for funding that has come from other sources, although there may be cases where that ends up making the most sense in some areas. But thinking about, there's one question about how do these dollars get allocated over a 17-year period. And then there's kind of if you take the plane up, the bigger question about how is Buncombe County continuing to develop a strategy that is first and foremost saving lives by reducing overdose deaths and reducing overdoses, and then creating services and programs to help people rebuild their lives. And it's so exciting to see how robustly you all are building out this set of questions around how the settlement funding will be allocated. And that, of course, ties into this broader question, but just also flagging at the commission level that part of why we want to get this fresh data and updates at our next meeting is so that we can kind of take the plane up in that way and say, okay, what are we seeing in terms of trends? And how do we take this step from, I think, where we've been, which is having, in some ways, very innovative, very impactful projects that sometimes operate discretely from each other, into having a truly integrated county-level strategy around the next chapter of our work in response to the opioid crisis, which continues to really hit our community hard, and so many in our community really hard. So just kind of previewing some of the conversations that I hope we can all dig into at our next meeting. But then as this work continues and through the budget cycle, and how we think about the settlement funding as sort of a piece of this broader policy, but also budgetary work that needs to happen. So,
and as you said that, and I'm glad you did, because I think what's important is what's our foundation, right? What do we know, whether it's opioids, whether it's methamphetamine, whether it's something else, right, that is coming into our community? Do we as a county have the infrastructure and that foundation to provide support to services? And then we're using opioid to maybe, right, tackle that one specific, expand additional access to support. Because obviously the opioid settlement is not going to be able to support all of these strategies that are needed and over the 17 years. So what do we want to invest in that we know will be flexible no matter what we're facing? What epidemic could pop up tomorrow? We're already seeing polysubstance use is a big issue, and so it's not just addressing opioids, it's even diving into the other substances that are coming up. So I think that it is important, that long-term plan, what do we want to have as our foundation, and then how do we supplement and target specific needs?
What I'm glad to see too is that we know we need the long-term plan. It's going to be over 17 years, but you're taking it in pieces, like from now until 26. I think that's good because that allows us to do our job, putting the budget, putting all that together, and we know where we need to, how we going to eat this pie, and doing it year to year. I think the pieces would be too small.
Yeah.
But I really like what you're doing there because that we can get the biggest bang, I think, for our buck that way.
Yeah, and then we can reevaluate what is
Right.
today,
That's
what's
it.
needed,
That's it.
and adjust.
Yeah. because it will change.
It will. Yes. Right. All right, well, thank you all.
I have a question.
Thank you.
So it looks great. I really appreciate the update. I guess one question I had is, are the opioid settlement funds, are any of them intended to be invested in terms of like future prevention type of work, whatever that might look like? Or just looking at these programs, it looks like they're focused on, providing support and options for folks who have developed, an opioid or some other related kind of addiction. So just curious if that's part of that, or are the efforts to do those types of works not occurring through these resources?
They're not necessarily occurring through these resources, but that's collaborative strategic planning is where we'll be looking more, and again, still, what does this look like? But how do we tap into some of those providers that are doing that work from young people? How do we get feedback from young people about what they truly need? Being part of a group that was looking at the faces of recovery, and how do we let young people know that if they need help to reach out? And those young people said, we don't care about a poster. Give us something on TikTok, like show us a little video. And so I think this is a time where we're going to really need to dive in and hear from our young people what's needed, what are those resources. One thing that I am hearing, though, is, and even for those families, is where do I go for these services? Where are those supports? So being able to recognize, do we have the supports and services available, but we need to educate our community more on how to access them? Are there some low-hanging fruits, or do we need to really create a new program? A lot of training has been done in Buncombe County for mental health youth first aid. Is that something that we need to add? There's not enough? Or do we need to now add on to that, something new and different, or maybe more specific? So really in these next couple months, and the funds for collaborative strategic planning will help us learn more about what our community needs for early intervention and what would make that difference.
What organizations in the community are working on that piece? I mean, I know like within the medical community, of course, there's been a lot of attention in recent years around the issues of overprescribing of opioids for legitimate medical purposes, but if they're overprescribed or not carefully prescribed, then they, I guess at least when the commission's been briefed on that in the past, I think we heard that that's actually the single largest source of how people develop addictions, right? It's not through recreational drug use, it's through being prescribed these opioids for legitimate medical purposes, but then, unintentionally developing, an addiction to them. I don't know if that's still the primary, like entryway into this, or if that's changed, but who's working on that side of it?
I think, one, the Partnership for Substance-Free Youth is doing that work of sharing that knowledge, the take-backs. And I think it's even, what I've noticed in the work that I've done and working with young people, and especially with the pandemic, is losing their purpose. What do I have to look forward to in life? Dealing with even their stressors from their parents, right? Our young people have trauma. And sometimes they're traumatized from adults who have been traumatized and haven't healed. So I think it is that like deeper hole of like what's going to make the most impact. And that's what we hope to really dive into. I know Buncombe County Schools is doing a lot in looking at incorporating social emotional learning. United Way's communities and schools have some contracts to provide school support groups. So it's not for any students, insurance isn't a question. They don't need to have a diagnosis, but looking at anxiety, building relationships. And so there are some of those programs in the community, but is it needing more of it, or needing to expand in a tailoring services in a different way than what we have right now?
Okay. Well, sometime just as part of these overall discussions, I would be interested in sort of hearing some more updates around that, because obviously I think there's a lot of these strategies are really promising. I mean, and so I'm super supportive of everything that you've gone over, but just would love to hear more about the current thinking from those who are most involved in it around what are the opportunities, to reduce the pipeline of future, addiction channels in the community so that over time, hopefully that's, that's diminishing because it's just so pervasive. Like, what options are there on the front end to kind of reduce the entryway into it? So anyway, thank you for the updates. And commissioners, any other questions or comments on this item? All right, thank you so much,
Thank you all.
Victoria. All right, commissioners, that's really the one update we had. So let's adjourn this meeting and we will reconvene at 5 o'clock for the regular meeting.